Good evening, everyone. Welcome to this author interaction of the 2022 NLF Reading Challenge. My name is Deepthi, and I'm very excited to be here. We hope you are too. The NLF Reading Challenge is a 4-month-long reading event from March to June 2022, involving students between 10 to 13 years of age. It runs for participants on the competitive and the non-competitive tracks. We have students from across India participating in the challenge. In addition to fun book-based activities and regular author interactions, the challenge will conclude with a quiz competition that will see the 3 best teams win gold, silver, and bronze engraved trophies respectively, certificates of achievement, and a great set of books. Before we dive into the interaction, we just wanted to let you know to please use the Q&A box to type out your questions or your responses to what's being discussed during the session. If you're a student, a teacher, or a school librarian, please mention the name of your school along with your question as well. Today, we are privileged to have with us the author Julian Sedgwick. Julian is the author of 6 books for children and co-author of a graphic novel, Dark Satanic Mills, with his brother Marcus Sedgwick, and also an illustrated novel, Voyages in the Underworld of Orpheus Black. In addition to being a writer, he also worked as an academic bookseller, painter, researcher, and script developer for film and TV, and also a Zen shiatsu therapist. Today, Julian is here to speak with us about his book, Tsunami Girl, which he says is the product of his lifelong immersion in Japanese culture, history, and belief. Shortlisted for the 2022 Yoto Carnegie Medal this year, Tsunami Girl is part manga, part prose, all-powerful coming-of-age story of 15-year-old Yuki Hara Jones, who gets caught up in the March 2011 Great Eastern Japan earthquake and tsunami. Welcome, Julian. We're very happy to have you with us today.
It's great to be with you. Thank you very much indeed. And I look forward to fielding some questions.
Absolutely. So do you want to get started with a reading from your book?
Yeah, so I'll just set up the reading in case people haven't read all of it yet. Yuki has arrived in Japan. She is my central character. She is having a real problem in her life. She's become very anxious. She's finding it hard to go to school. And in desperation, her parents have sent her from the UK, where she's growing up, to her Japanese grandfather on the coast of northeast Japan. Once upon a time, Yuki could draw like anything. She had real confidence when she was a young little artist, and her grandfather is trying to remind her by showing her old drawings what she used to be like, in the hopes it will help her to recover. So I'll just read a little bit from the early chapter. Yuki watches as Grandpa flips the concertina pages of the book in front of her. The thick paper has yellowed a tiny bit, but the colored pencil is still vibrant, so certain, so childish. It feels like someone else drew the images. But the weird thing is, she remembers doing every single drawing as soon as they pop into view. And on every page is at least one simple but sure-handed drawing of a boy with bright blue wavy hair, running on a shrine roof, diving down between clouds fish to a sinking ship, gliding through tangled fragments of Japanese and misspelt English and sound effects. Grandpa sits back, and instinctively Yuki leans forward and turns to the next page to reveal a mountainous wave, colored in every shade of blue you could imagine. And riding barefoot on the wave's back, there he is again, the boy, in traditional summer clothing, his bright hair standing straight up, his face more smile than anything else. When you smile like that, Grandpa says quietly, you could chase any shadow from any corner of any place, no matter what. Once upon a time, mukashi mukashi, there was a boy, an underwater boy who could ride the waves on bare feet and loved to sing, and whose song controlled the waters of the world. He came from out of the sea, but loved the land and the people who lived on it, and had a huge heart and eyes that could see clearly. Who calmed the catfish who caused the earthquakes and rescued sailors in distress and dealt with any trouble that came along, vengeful ghosts, naughty kappa monsters, and kitsune fox spirits. Tsunamis, maybe. And Halfwave's song floated under the stars as he surfed the waves, and everything was fine, totally fine. Young Yuki dreamed him up from wherever our heroes come from, and he in turn made her. But in the end, the little hero slipped away into the water, forgotten in the usual mess of growing up, just as a wave breaks and merges back into the ocean again. And unfortunately, Yuki has arrived on the coast of Japan the day before the Great East Japan earthquake and tsunami disaster. And so the book is obviously about how she deals with that.
Yes, and that's a powerful setting to set your story in, right? And thank you for choosing that particular piece. So we have, let's get started with our first question then. So we have two stories running parallelly in Tsunami Girl, like you just read out. We have the reality that Yuki experiences, which is written in prose, and the otherworldly manga that you've woven into the story, which features Yuki's childhood creation, Half-Wave. So this narration has a multiplicity to it because we see two versions of the same story. It is almost like Yuki, who has two different sides to her. She's Japanese as well as British, but they seem to come together to create a seamless whole. Just like the two different narratives blend together seamlessly in the book. Was this a parallel that you intended to create when you visualized the book, or was this something that came into place organically?
This was very much an organic process. The book took me 5 years in total, and it had lots of different versions. And I knew I wanted to have this manga and prose component because the grandfather was always going to be a manga artist. And, 40% of everything that's published in Japan is manga. So I wanted to try and do this combined storytelling, but it took me so long to come up with the mechanism that would work. And often when I start writing a book, it feels a bit clunky and arbitrary. You're trying to find how the story's going to work. And it was only late on when I realized that the manga pages would be drawn by Yuki after everything has happened, that sort of, it's going to work, it's going to work. So I had, I can show you here, I can hold up one of these. I draw lots and lots of charts like this when I'm working, which you probably won't be able to read anything on, but that's me desperately trying to work out the mechanism, and I've got loads of those. And then one day you suddenly find the solution.
Wow, those look really detailed. So just to quickly go back to that. So you wrote the manga before you contacted the illustrator, the wonderful Chiya Kutsuwada?
Yes, indeed. In this case, because for quite a long time, publishers were not sure about this book. So I couldn't really commit to contract an illustrator until there was contract. So I wrote the whole book, and the manga parts I wrote as film script because I'd worked a lot in film, and essentially you're trying to do the same thing as, show a visual story in words in a screenplay. So I had that pretty much in place. And then when Chia came along, she made a lot of contributions to shifting the manga a bit because she's a very experienced manga artist, and also some little cultural things that she wanted to adjust as well.
That sounds great. And so you did a lot of research, of course, before writing this book, and you spoke to a lot of survivors of the disaster. So this must have been incredibly difficult listening to firsthand stories of the aftermath. It must have also been difficult to narrow down all the different stories, the different experiences you heard into a single narrative. But you've managed to capture a very real sense of loss and rootlessness that has occurred post the disaster. And before you answer that question, we also have a related thought that struck us while reading the book. And that was the subtle way that you drew attention to the plight of the nuclear power plant workers. And we see this when there's a taxi driver who's talking to Yuki, and they're looking at the power plant workers removing the topsoil that is affected with radiation. And he says, "You tell me where they're going to put it all, miss. Some poor farmer's backyard, no doubt." With this almost throwaway line, you make it clear to the reader that the brunt of establishing a nuclear power plant in an earthquake prone area was borne by the people who are often sidelined and pushed to the periphery. And we've seen this play out over the last 2 years as well with the pandemic, where it quickly became evident that the brunt of the crisis was felt most acutely by those who do not have economic, political, or cultural privilege. Is this something that you saw or heard about when you journeyed through Japan? Also, how did you deal with all of this traumatic stories and manage to write an optimistic story of courage and hope? I'm guessing your experience as a therapist must have helped with this.
Yeah, there's so much I want to say about all this. These are such thoughtful questions. So, Deepthi, you just interrupt me when you've heard too much. Okay, so
Please go on.
yeah, when probably I was thinking Tsunami Girl is probably built out of hundreds of fragments of other people's stories, and obviously I wanted to treat them with huge respect. And I met a lot of people, friends I haven't been able to get. These are some of the very close friends I've made in the area, and listened to people's stories firsthand. And felt their emotion and felt their trauma, because let's not kid ourselves, there is still trauma there. 10 years on, 11 years on, for the people of Fukushima in particular, this is an ongoing disaster, and they don't want their story to be forgotten. So the thing that really encouraged me was on my first trip there, I wanted to see if they would feel okay about me making this story. And they said, yes, please do, because we want this story to be told and read as widely as possible. So it was overwhelming to hear some of the stories. I mean, grim things about people losing family members, about losing their homes. Also people who haven't been able to return to their homes in the nuclear disaster area now still for 11 years. But that sense of, I found also this sense of great hope and optimism. And that gave me the key to write the book, because as a therapist, I've been a therapist for 25 years, and I must have heard almost every facet of the human condition, but people always find a way. Or if they don't find a way, they find an accommodation, or they find a chink of hope, or they find something to keep going with. So all of that was in my mind when I came to the book, and I didn't want it to be simplistic. Oh, well, here's a problem and you get over it just by doing this. So I wanted Yuki to really struggle with how she was dealing with it, and to try and encompass some of what I've heard. But I was particularly pleased you picked up on that line, that throwaway line, because the thing is, we craft all these lines and you think, is anyone reading all these lines? I don't know, and certainly in the north of Japan, the northeast, it's always felt like it's been a forgotten area. It was often seen as a more rural area, a kind of poorer area. And very much the people of Fukushima felt they had to supply electricity to Tokyo for 20, 30 years, and now they're reaping the whirlwind of that power generation, because the nuclear power plant is still dangerous. There was a big aftershock just a couple of weeks ago, and immediately what my friends are thinking, 12 kilometers from the power plant, is what has that done to the power plant? Also, there's 1 million tons of radioactive water on the site. No one knows what to do with. And then as you drive around the area, as I have done, you come across these enormous fields full of these huge black bags of topsoil. And your Geiger counter kicks up a bit, because this is low-level radiation. And there is a sense that, they have been slightly forgotten, and they're still dealing with this problem. So I really wanted to touch on that, particularly with the Olympics last year, meant to be the year before, where Japan was trying to show everything is recovered, and for my friends in the disaster zone, they feel it's not a done deal yet. So sorry, a long answer, but those are all themes that obviously I was really, really keen to bring out in the book, and I'm glad if people are picking up on them.
Thank you for that answer. And again, I really can't imagine how hard it must have been to put all of that into one book, and you've done it so well. We have some audience questions here. So Arav Chaoji asks, how did you think of the character Yuki, and is it connected to someone in your life?
Oh, yeah, it's really interesting actually, because this central character, as has happened to me before, started off as a boy, and the book wasn't working, and the book worked better when she became a girl called Yuki. But I realized, I don't think I have got a picture of him here on my wall of happiness. This is my younger son, who, when he was a small boy, drew and drew and drew. And we were traveling in Japan a lot in those days, and he would create superheroes. And unlike a lot of kids, he would then model that superhero for months. So my Will is quite a model for Yuki. And, probably for her anxious elements, I was a very anxious child. I really struggled with anxiety. I struggled with school phobia. I had a terrifying school experience that I won't go into now because it takes too long. But, so I was drawing on very much on my own experience as a young person, and then bringing a bit of, maybe a bit of my son in there.
Absolutely. And I saw on your website where you mentioned empathy and connection are two of your main motivations for writing. And there's so much familial connection in the book, right? So Yuki and her relationship with her grandfather, her somewhat strained relationship with her parents, her newly forming relationship with the boys in her life. And of course, there's so much empathizing as well with Yuki's panic attacks about her not being able to fit in. And of course, the devastating after effects of the disaster, the unimaginable loss of human life.
Mhm.
So when you're writing, is this an intentional starting point? Are you always thinking about how to put empathy and connection in the book, or is it something that comes naturally when you write? I'm sure the writers in the audience would love to know this.
Yeah, I think it does come. I think it's the thing that comes easiest to me as a writer. Maybe because of being a therapist for so long. So I'll sometimes work with the same different members of the same family and hear the same problem from lots of different people's points of view. And at the end of a therapy week, I'm thinking, wow, human relationships, family interconnections, this is a complicated machine, and I'm sure everyone has experienced that in their lives. But I think I just feel I want to handle those gently and with care. I was like Chekhov as a writer. He was a doctor as well. I'm not comparing myself to Chekhov for a minute, okay, but he was a doctor as well as a writer, and I thought he had that same way of just trying to hold all the characters gently and think, well, they're doing their best. They're doing their best. They're trying to do this, and sometimes that sets people against each other. But yeah, I really want to bring that sense of tenderness to characters always, even the difficult ones.
That's really interesting. And another really interesting about your work is the gothic element. You've done a lot of horror books. Previously, you've done gothic graphic novels. And
Mm.
in this particular book, Tsunami Girl, it's very eerie and it's gothic. And post-tsunami, Osoma is visualized as a ghost town where time stands still. The newspaper found there after a year dates back to the day of the tsunami. However, the spirits feel spooky for sure, but not harmful. There are benevolent spirits and some who are almost sad, searching for something, coming back to something. We see this especially in the case of the ghost girl who takes the taxi back home every time it rains. We
Mm.
also see a philosophical take on ghosts and spirits when Yuki questions whether she is alive or not after almost drowning in the tsunami. So, could you talk a little bit about why and how you decided to present a fresh take on ghosts and on spirits who linger around after death?
This is an interesting question. I never set out to write about ghosts, and I'm not really interested. I think the other ghosts I have handled in books, they don't tend to be horrific or jump scares. I'm not so interested in gore or anything like that. I can't watch horror films, for example. But after the tsunami, there were so many cases of these ghost stories occurring up and down the coast of Japan. And what linked most of them was they weren't out to sort of get revenge or anything. They were just sad and they wanted to go home, or they didn't know where they should go. And the stories that are kind of interesting me are almost this kind of like ghost therapy. It's like, trying to find out what the spirit needs and trying to give that thing to them. This happens in traditional Japanese literature in Noh theatre. You've often got a spirit that has unfinished business and they're trying to find their way with it. And some of those stories, like the girl in the taxi, have become urban legends. So I wanted to kind of play with those a little bit and maybe invert or change them a little bit. The ghost taxi stories go right back almost to the earliest taxis in Tokyo. It's you get them in a lot of cultures. But yeah, it was when I was in the zone 7 years after the disaster, and I was in an abandoned supermarket, and in the doorway to the supermarket there were these newspapers from the day of the disaster, and they were slowly being mushed by the wind and rain. And your mind starts to play tricks on you. It's a very empty space, and this is what particularly drew me to that part of the disaster zone, was this emptiness, and how then the emptiness conjures things out of your imagination or out of trauma. So I wanted to kind of look at that and see what came out of it, really.
Thank you for that. So we have two somewhat related questions. We have from the audience.
Mm.
We have Rupa from Parikrama School asking, my question is, how do you choose characters for stories? And Jahan Raj Singh from Neve Academy asks, what inspired you to make the character Yuki half British and half Japanese?
Oh, interesting. Yeah, related questions. Characters arrive in a strange way. You know, I said rather mechanically, this central character is a bit William and a bit me, but it's also lots of half British, half Japanese kids I've met and talked to over my school visiting years. They slowly take form, and they do start off as almost slightly placeholders, I find, and then you start thinking about them, you start inhabiting them, you bring in little bits of other people you've met or just little things you've heard, and suddenly they do come to life. And when I used to hear writers say that, I thought, oh, come on, you know, does that really happen? But I feel it does, and you start to hear them talk to you, or you hear their voice, and then you know they're working, and then slowly you forget what the elements are. For the I often seem to write characters who are half one thing, half another, or quarter something, three quarters something. I am, you know, clearly white, middle-aged British guy. I'm part Irish, but I never knew where my place was in the world. I could never find where I fitted. So I quite like to draw these characters, make these characters who are kind of on the edge of things, because that's where I always was. I was always on the edge, looking in, trying to find where I fitted or where home was. So it's a nice way of doing that. And the lovely thing is, a lot of the parents of half Japanese, half British kids who've read the book, and the kids themselves are really enjoying the book and say it's like their experience, which is a big relief for me, because that's something I worried about a bit.
Yes, and that's also something that I wanted to ask you about, because you have mentioned that you have a strong connection to Japanese culture, but you also felt like you were an outsider with one foot in the culture. So you were talking about that a little bit right now, but were you worried about getting specific cultural nuances right? So the book has been received quite well around the world. It's found itself on a lot of prestigious shortlists. But before you published, did you worry about how the book would be received?
Yeah. I mean, I worry about everything, so you're definitely worried about that. I worried about it. No, I've spent 20 years traveling backwards and forwards to Japan. Some of the most important people in my life have been Japanese friends and a kind of quasi father figure I had. So I knew I could get maybe the very close on the nuances, and then I employed a sensitivity reader who is a young Japanese female academic, and she had done therapeutic listening in the disaster zone after the tsunami. So her name is Nanase, and she was just fantastic. She gave me really detailed feedback. I was more worried about whether people would misperceive my intentions or my sense of entitlement or something like that. So when I approached Chia by email, and I'd heard she was really good manga artist, but very direct and straightforward. And she says now, when we do events, she said, "Oh, who's this guy? What does he know about it?" And we had some quite honest conversations, and very quickly she, I think, felt that she had trust in me, that I'd been to the zone, that I'd talked to lots of people, that they felt good about the project. And when Chia finally read the manuscript, she said the nicest thing, because she said it felt like I was reading it in Japanese. And I could have cried at that point, because I almost could now, because it was like, oh, okay, maybe it's all right, because as I say, I'm a warrior. So I wanted to treat this with a lot of respect, a lot of care of all the books I've done.
Yeah, that must have been a huge relief to hear her say that.
Absolutely.
So we have a question from Varsha Seshan, who's a well-known Indian author, Indian children's author. So she asks, you spoke about not knowing whether manga would work within this book. Do you often play with form when you write?
Oh, it's a lovely question. Thank you. Not deliberately, but I realize I have been. So the new book I'm working on with Chia is yet another slightly different form. And the illustrated novel I did with my brother, the Orpheus book, was a different form again. And the graphic novel was a different form again. And I think I'd like to write mechanics that I understand, but I suspect I actually enjoy trying to work out how something new will work. So I suspect I'm enjoying playing with form more than I think, although I get very stressed about it. So thank you for that question.
So There is an audience question here that I'm not sure if you want to answer because it might be giving away a bit of the story. Taran Murthy asks, who buried the kimono doll at the top of the block?
Oh, it's a really good question. The thing is that the way the prose and the manga interact, I want to leave space for each reader to make their own mind up about that, because I have different opinions on it on different days, to be honest. So some of the things that happen towards the end of the book, I want to leave in a hazy space where each person can make their own mind up. And that's where I am with ghosts, really. People say to me, do you believe in ghosts? Like today I might, tomorrow I might not, the next day I'm like this. So I'm going to duck that question, but I thank you for that question.
All right. And very well-deserved recognition that Tsunami Girl has received. It is on the 2022 Carnegie Medal shortlist. This is your second Carnegie shortlist, if I'm not wrong. Congratulations on that.
Thank you.
And I'm sure you must be over the moon, but do you have any thoughts on that? How do you feel about this achievement?
I'll say this, that I wanted to be, from about the age of 10, I wanted to be a writer. And for 37 years, I couldn't work out how to make it work. So I only got published first when I was 47. And then I've been 10 more years kind of trying to work out exactly what I want to write and how I want to write it. So I am cliche over the moon about this, because particularly for this book, because of what my friends in Fukushima said, we want as many people to hear this story as possible. What something like the Carnegie does, or what you're doing here today, which is obviously a lovely setup you've got. This is fantastic, because that's why I wrote the book. So yeah, I'm really thrilled.
Definitely. Thank you so much for joining us, Julian. It was an amazing conversation. I cannot believe half an hour just flew by like that. And thank you for such eloquent answers. And thank you for taking the time out to meet our students, the students of India. I'm sure they enjoyed meeting you today. We wish you all the best. And we're really glad to see the recognition that Tsunami Girl is receiving. Thank you for bringing us Yuki's story.
Thank you very much indeed. And again, thanks for those really thoughtful questions and for the work you're doing. And thank you to everyone who tuned in, and have a good rest of your day. Thank you.
Thank you.